All right, Alexander, let's talk about the Biden presidency and the fact that we now know that the Build Back Better is pretty much done for, thanks to Joe Manchin, pretty much. But there were a lot of other problems with Build Back Better, so we shouldn't throw all the blame on Joe Manchin. But he definitely took the strong line to not support it. And in the U.S. domestically, it is really hit Biden hard. So his Build Back Better, 2.2 trillion, which really was going to be something like 5 trillion at the end of the day. That bill is done, and they're going to have to look to rework it one way or another come 2022. And a lot of people focus on the reactions inside the United States with the death of Build Back Better. But in this video, let's focus on how this has affected the Biden presidency on a geopolitical level. What are you seeing with regards to Biden's signature, his signature piece of legislation being thrown in the dustbin, and how that has affected his standing in the international community? Already a very, very weak standing at that, but this has definitely not helped his presidency and the way leaders in countries view the Biden administration.
Right, the thing to say about this story is that it's cut through. I mean, normally, most governments around the world, obviously, they keep an eye on what goes on in the US, but they have difficulty sometimes following the intricacies of US domestic politics. And as far as they're concerned, the president is the president. He heads the administration. He's the person that they have to deal with. And, if he has the odd setback in Congress, well, that's part of American politics, and they're not too concerned. Governments are not generally too concerned. This time it's different. It's cut through. If you read reports around the world, I sent you just before this program a report from India, but it's by MS Badrakumar. We'll talk about that in a moment. But reports all around the world, in Asia, in the Middle East, everywhere, the perception now is that this administration, that this president, is mortally wounded politically, that his authority in the United States has collapsed, and that in effect he is no longer in charge of the full charge of the United States. I say he, I mean the administration, perhaps not him personally, but where this new administration looked like it would be a strong administration taking charge of the United States, at least that's what many people foolishly believed, in my opinion, at the start of this year. They now see it as an administration that is in advanced disintegration. And I would add that I've talked about places outside the West, but of course there's also now the perception in many places within the West. I've been reading, the British and German media. They've been reporting on the collapse, the failure of Build Back Better. They also now sense that this administration is dying, that it's in an advanced state of collapse.
How does that affect the world, though? All the issues that we have going on. For example, you could say the U.S.'s adversaries, Russia and China, they're looking on this, and the common perception would be that they're emboldened. That's what you hear from the media too, many times, especially something like Fox News, for example, will say, China and Russia, they're emboldened by Biden's incompetence. On the flip side, you have EU and NATO, and they were all excited when Biden got into office, obviously, especially someone like Merkel, who's not in office anymore, but all the EU heads and all of these people who didn't really get along with Trump, but Biden came into office, and they were excited. America is back. That was the catchphrase. America is back, right? And America and Europe and the EU, well, they're now going to be a force to be reckoned with. The combined power of the United States and Europe, and then of course you have the UK and the fact that Boris would have been better served if Trump was president, because they probably would have signed some very big trade deals. But nonetheless, Boris has stood by Biden's side to a very ridiculous degree, if you want my opinion. He's really stood by Biden's continual losses. And it's actually kind of hurt Boris in the UK, to be quite honest, in my opinion. So what do you make of the different way this is spun around the globe, whether it's the adversaries, the allies, and the UK, where you are located?
Let's talk first about the adversaries. And here I'm going to say something which I think will astonish many Americans, but they look upon this with dismay. They do not want to see a weak administration in Washington. And I'm talking absolutely with confidence here about the views of the Chinese and the Russians. The reason they want a strong administration in Washington is firstly because if they have a strong administration in Washington, they have a sense of what the United States would do. It is a predictable administration. And if they have a strong president, it's a president that they can cut a deal with. The optimal president, from their point of view, the recent president that, for example, the Russians look back to was Ronald Reagan. He was a very strong president. He was very anti-communist, very anti-Soviet, but he was fully in charge of his house in Washington. And eventually, the Soviets found that they could deal with him. They could actually negotiate with him. And that is true all around the world. That is exactly what the Russians and the Chinese feel. They feel that we need a strong president in Washington. You can do a deal with that kind of a president. You can have that kind of deal stick. You do not want a situation where there are lots of different factions fighting each other in Washington in a state of a power vacuum, because that means that in that kind of situation, that sort of scenario, it is always the extreme hardliners who win out, and that makes the United States, as the Russians say, agreement incapable. So they want a strong government, they want a strong administration in Washington. They obviously want a clear-headed administration in Washington. They want an administration that is able to follow a consistent and predictable line, as to a great extent Reagan did in the 80s, and as they were hoping Donald Trump would do when he was elected. They do not want to see a weak president. They do not want to see, if I can put it somewhat differently, a manipulative and dishonest president like Barack Obama was, or to some extent, to a great extent, Bill Clinton was. They want a strong, consistent, firm president that they can both deal with and understand. That is the adversaries. Now, the allies are similarly dismayed, because from their point of view, they too want a clear, consistent president, a clear, consistent administration, a strong administration, because, of course, what they are looking for is a predictable partner in Washington, and one that they can rely upon, and one that they can understand, and one whose guidelines they can follow, and whose lead they can follow. The worry the Europeans especially have at the moment, the Europeans have become almost conditioned now to following America's lead, is that there is no clear lead, that the one day US policy will be one thing, the next day it will be something completely different. So at the moment, the administration is talking about, for example, negotiating some kind of security agreement with the Russians. Nobody knows what that means. Nobody has any expectation that that negotiation will be successful. And they all look back at the debacle in Afghanistan and they say, will we have this now on an even bigger scale from an administration, a president who is unable to pursue policy with any degree of consistency? So what's going to happen around the world is that various governments around the world, they're going to say to themselves, this administration is essentially dead. There's a power vacuum in Washington. The best thing we can do is to work our way round the United States. We're not going to deal directly with the United States with any expectation of achieving anything. We're going to start cutting our own deals with each other. And the US is now obviously incapable of pursuing an active policy. It is only a disruptor, so let's try and find ways around it.
All right. Finally, the other group that we need to discuss, Alexander, and that is the globalist oligarch class, which kind of cuts through both allies as well as adversaries. The globalist class, are they happy with Biden? Are they upset about the Build Back Better bill and Manchin? Obviously, the choice of names for the bill, Build Back Better. I mean, I believe Boris Johnson actually ran on Build Back Better as well. I mean, there's it's not a coincidence that you have all these governments using this catchphrase, Build Back Better, including the World Economic Forum and Mr. Dr. Evil himself, Klaus Schwab. But the oligarch, the globalist class, which they're embedded with the adversaries, they're embedded with the allies, they're in the Biden administration. Do you think they benefit from the decay, such a quick decay, such a rapid decay of this president?
Yes, I think that they are actually not just beneficiaries, but at some level, I suspect they quietly welcome all of this, because it's always important to remember that the one thing the oligarch class, the globalists and those people, the one thing they do not want is a strong government. They do not want a strong government that's able to, put them back in their place and perhaps start doing things that, might be difficult for them. So I think partly one of the reasons why Biden became president was because these people wanted a weak president, and they've got one. So, I think that's partly, what this is all about. They don't want a strong president. They don't want a president they can't control. They have a weak president and one they can control. Where I think some of them must be having some doubts now is that this is such a weak president. It is a president who is so politically, enfeebled. And as I said, it's important to say that the failure of Build Back Better has cut through around the world, that, this is in some ways now becoming dangerous for them. It could provoke a reaction within the United States itself. There's increasing worries that the orange man might be back. There's all these concerns and all these worries, and of course they are worried that perhaps things might indeed slip out of control, because yes, they wanted a weak president, but not one quite as weak as this one, and they wanted an administration that they could control, which meant a weak administration. But this administration is so weak and so chaotic that there are elements of it which are practically slipping out of control. So I think that they've got perhaps more than they bargained for. And I think that there may be some of the more intelligent ones amongst them, who are perhaps getting a bit nervous about this and are starting to say, well, hold on. Not only is this possibly going to provoke a reaction within the United States itself, but there is a risk that because other countries are now starting to make their own arrangements with each other, marginalizing the United States, that could result in us being marginalized too, because ultimately we rely on the power of the United States to keep our agenda moving forward. So there may be some people who are starting to have those doubts, and I wouldn't be surprised if they were, but it's important always to understand that these poor people did initially want a weak administration. And as I said, they've got it. They got it perhaps more than they expected. What do they say? Be careful what you wish for.
What you wish.
But it was what they probably wanted from the outset.
Yeah. Not only did they get a weaker than expected president, but they probably thought, well, we can have a confused vice president, a confused and dumbed down vice president, but they probably didn't expect it for her to be that confused, to be that dumbed down. So they have no plan B, no second option either. So yeah, It's not turning
You
out how
say that.
they.
You say
Yeah.
that. There's something which I have to say I've been picking up, on the fringes. I don't know how much this is true, but apparently there is now not so much about Plan B, maybe, but a Plan C, which is to turn to Hillary Clinton, believe it or not,
Clinton,
as the possible
the
savior
Clinton
that can be
plan.
brought back. I've actually read articles and comments, because apparently Michelle isn't too keen. So, who else, bring out the old war horse. So, who knows? Maybe 2024 it will be Trump versus Hillary again. An interesting rerun. But there we are. I'm not saying that's going to happen, and I don't know how serious these reports are. But the very fact that people are talking in that way shows, to my mind, how desperate the situation is becoming, and how worried some Democrats are. And we'll see. We'll see what comes. But the article on Indian Punchline was really very interesting, because the writer, who is an Indian diplomat, M.S. Badrakumar, is somebody who's very, very plugged in to information, to policy people, top people within the Indian government. Now, it should be said that he is a political opponent of the current Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. But it is interesting that over the last few weeks, India has been taking a number of steps to distance itself from the US. I mean, if you remember, there was this period of time when it looked as if India was drifting into some kind of alliance with the US against China. Well, the Indians have seem to have adjusted their policy. So they received Vladimir Putin, this incredibly friendly meeting with Putin in New Delhi. They had another incredibly friendly call. Modi had an incredibly friendly telephone call with Putin just a few days ago. In the middle of all this crisis in Europe, Modi has a conversation with Putin, and it signals a kind of, if not support, as I said, a sympathy for Putin in this situation. And there's increasing talk now of a summit meeting of China, of the leaders of China, India, and Russia. And this comes shortly after a foreign ministers' meeting of India, China, and Russia. So one gets a sense that the Indians, looking at this mess in Washington, are saying to themselves, well, you simply can't rely on the US in this situation. And, maybe we should start to hedge our bets with Moscow and Beijing. And that's directly what I said about countries giving up on the US and starting to cut their own deals with each other.
Yeah, and the Indian team, they have a very good a foreign policy team, and we said in the last video where we were discussing India that is the checkmate move.
Absolutely.
When it comes to geopolitics, would be Russia, China, and a very central, neutral India. That would be a checkmate move.
Absolutely, and you're absolutely right. I mean, the Indians have a superb foreign service. They are very well informed about what goes on in Washington. The Indian embassy in Washington, D.C. is extremely active. And of course, they're very, very well informed about what goes on there, probably more than those of most governments. And, they're perfectly capable of making the kind of analyses that we've talked about. And I'm sure they have done. So, when the Indians, when reports are appearing, I mean, I think the Indian Punchline article was, the title was Joe Biden Presidency on the Skids, World Must Take Note. What it really means, of course, is that India must take note, that it's the Indians who must make that kind of assessment that this administration is not functional, and it's not able to make decisions, that it might not be around for very long.
Yeah, but it's just to wrap it up. It's momentum as well. As the world sees a power like India taking note and moving away. Well, what do you think the smaller countries are going to do as well? I mean, they're also going to hedge their bets.
Well, exactly. That's precisely what they're going to do. I mean, obviously, there is no country can ignore the US completely. It remains a mighty power, even when the president himself is barely functional, or the administration is barely functional. But more and more countries are going to say to themselves, well, America is clearly adrift. They're in a deep political crisis, which is clearly unresolved. And what we've got to do, therefore, is turn to the rising sun instead of the setting sun. And the sun is rising at the moment in Beijing, where at least the government is purposeful and knows what it's about. And, that may not be something that Western governments like Boris Johnson's are able to do. Germany might. I mean, Germany's a slightly different position. But the other countries around the world, the countries in the Middle East, in Asia, in Latin America, they will be making those kind of assessments. And it's notable that Blinken had an extremely unsuccessful tour of Africa a few weeks ago, and apparently his latest tour, which was of Southeast Asia, didn't go terribly well either. And perhaps in all the context of what we're talking about, that's not surprising.
Yeah, that's the problem. It's Biden is, okay, we all know Biden's situation, but it is also everyone in and around Biden. One person is worse than the other, from Kamala to Blinken to Sullivan. I mean, it's bad to worse. And everyone sees these people running around the world, taking these meetings, trying to engage diplomacy. And, everyone's like, this is a sinking ship, this administration. It's time to explore our options.
Exactly.
They meet Blinken, and that's what they say. It's time to explore our options. We can't deal with these guys.
Well, exactly.
The damage that's being done is irreparable.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, we've had all these disastrous trips. There was Kamala Harris's trip when she went to Vietnam, and the Vietnamese, while she was there, called in the Chinese ambassador to tell him, pay no attention to what this person is saying. Our friendship with you is, far greater. I mean, and the same thing happened essentially when Blinken was touring Africa. He was having all these trips around various African countries, and at the same time as Blinken was touring their capitals, the leaders of these countries were openly talking to the Chinese, cutting deals with them. And I gather the same thing is true of Blinken's latest trip in Southeast Asia. They look at these people, they're not impressed by them. And if the administration appeared strong domestically, they would deal with them. But as the administration looks weak domestically, they say to themselves, why bother?
Yeah, these people are lightweights. They're think tankers. They should not be getting on a plane, meeting with world leaders. None of these people are competent enough to hold the positions that they've been appointed to. None of them.
Oh, indeed. Well, I mean, BITCHUTE is a case in point. I mean, he's an Indian diplomat, ex-diplomat, from a diplomatic family in India. And I mean, you come from a diplomatic family, you know that the tradition of diplomacy gets passed down. People have tremendous insight in diplomatic matters. And BITCHUTE wrote this utterly scathing comment about Blinken. And he says he's a nice man who writes elegant memos for senators. That's all I mean. It's killing Blinken off with faint praise. I mean, it's not even for praise, really. I mean, it's scathing to say something like that. But that's how BITCHUTE summed him up. And again, BITCHUTE is plugged into the whole Indian diplomatic foreign policy community. And he's definitely passing comments that are being passed around within that community about Blinken.
All right. We will leave it there. The Duran.locals.com. Everybody, ODYSEE, BitChute, Rumble, and Super is where you will find our videos. And go to the Duran shop. Use the code GOODDAY and get 10% off all our merchandise. And Alexander has a Good Day mug.
Absolutely.
Yes,
wouldn't be without one.
All right. To use that, use Good Day at checkout, and you will get 10% off. Take care, everybody.